So basically I was thinking how to structure kind of this understanding of what the Ukrainian crisis implications were, because there are several levels of that. It probably is a broader European context, and Ukraine itself, because there's some specific issues about that, and of course, how we perceive energy and how we started to perceive energy like a security issue, because it's not always like that, because the interdependence and dependence not always security has security implications. It's not always a bad thing in a market. So probably just to start from Ukraine, you know more or less everyone here that Ukraine is important transit territory for transmission territory for gas supplies into Europe. So just to specify, and especially Slovakia is important as it holds the biggest transmission capacity on the border with Ukraine, on the Ukrainian and European Union border. But here it's important to think today, with all these projects that Ukraine is ongoing and getting closer and is a contracted party in energy community. So where we would place now, where ends the European gas network transmission system? So probably already like long time ago, Ukraine had already to put a gas metering station already on the border of Russia and Ukraine. Now, factually, with all commercial projects that are going on, like reverse flows and other projects that I'm going to outlook like a little bit later, Ukraine is gradually already becoming a part of EU's gas network. What it implies that already you don't have to count the border probably in the future, several years, when it will be legally already adopted by the parliament and Ukrainian parliament and already European Union counterparts, that they count how much Russia would supply, it would be already counted on the border of Russia and Ukraine. That would eliminate 50% of any kind of problems of negotiating, and of course, any accusations that Ukraine would siphon some kind of some amount of gas on its territory won't be applicable. That's really important to see. And in theory, Russian gas can be already pumped, in the whole volume always could be pumped already through Ukraine. Why it's important to mention, because if we follow all big projects like Nord Stream and South Stream recently cancelled, the main point of it is that when you construct an energy project and the infrastructure, you should be interested firstly in return of investment. And this should be, your first priority when you consider actually to invest. Unfortunately, this kind of projects, they already were considered probably mostly in political lines. That, again, I probably repeat for you already obvious things, but just to summarize them, how the things happen. Because the point today, even if you look on the broader concept of European Union and EU single market approach, where we are leading here and heading here, it's about not just to put new pipelines around, just to connect, not just for connecting. It's about bringing liquidity, and by bringing liquidity, we balance the price. And by that point, that we can sometimes upgrade those pipelines that we don't use. And that means the investment will be lower and return on investment will be much faster. And at this point, if you construct just pipelines just not to cross Ukraine and go around, of course the kilometer and the price per kilometer is it's huge, so it's big investment, and investors should be also European parties. That's big risk. That's basically what happened already with South Stream. Of course, with South Stream there were different implications about third energy package, and of course it's easier to put it on Turkish-Greek borders than it will be outside the European legal sphere. So it's kind of easier, but if we look that we can still utilize this transmission system, if we consider that this transmission system of Ukraine would be already legally integrated into the European transmission lines completely. So that would be already concern of all European countries already to see those pipelines as a part of it, so upgrade them and utilize them. So now actually Ukraine already adopted somewhere in September the legislation that it does not allow Russian part to apply for investment in gas GTS of Ukraine. So it seeks for international investors. Of course, any investor now appeared like, over the hill because it's too risky, but that's the point of political messages. So if political messages will start to go out, so the investor would appear, and if you're already part of investment on this pipeline, so you would probably, already change the security concept of Ukraine as a transit country. So the problem now it's shifting from the naming, from naming Ukraine as a transit country to applying to Ukraine already as a part of European transmission network of gas. That's kind of an important concept to understand if we already have all these pipelines. Energy somehow became, in the sense of Ukraine and European Union and Russia, in a line of constant negotiations and constant political negotiations, right? And what's important here to underline those are three concepts, three understandings of negotiation and three party interests. That's what happened in the negotiations in autumn 2014, when Ukraine was left out without, Russia basically stopped supplying gas. Of course, the political and crisis implications, and Ukraine was without government, but it's in effect was without gas already from June. So they had to negotiate. At this point, there are three-party interests, and of course, Europe is the security of supply. Security of supply is basic concept that it needs. Then, of course, Russia. It's also important to understand the security of demand because it's a major export market. And the major export market, it means, is also the major profit, income. Ukraine, of course, the transit state. Here is it also important to remember about profits that it gets from being a transit way. And especially now, with economic implications of all crises ongoing, any budget income for Ukraine is important. And by understanding what I mentioned before, that we would imagine that Ukraine becomes already part of European gas transmission system, it would lose this kind of part of income, but it would be calculated already by other implications. And of course, the results of negotiations, it's good to remember that they were temporary, so they would run out in 31st of March. Why it's important to know? Because it was good that they were temporary, because now an arbitrary court in Stockholm has to rule out the decision, and before it ruled out any decisions, that Gazprom has to pay some coverage to Ukraine because both parties were breaking the contract. That's why we would now see even the worst, I think, round of negotiations starting from somewhere around April, May. Why it's even more important, because when on further slides I will show you how the looming crisis or energy crisis in Ukraine is. Because for Ukraine it's more important the period of summer and autumn when you fulfill the gas storages. And to fulfill the gas storages, so you secure the winter. And those negotiations would start in April, May. So they would have to agree that Russia would start supplying gas. So as for Ukraine, it's very important to fulfill storage. To fulfill storage is also important crisis implication for European Union. If Ukraine won't have enough in storages, so it would be more dependent on European countries' decisions to reverse some gas. I don't think that they would siphon now, because now Ukraine is a part of a transparency network of European Union, so it supplies now online all gas it transmitted daily. So it's more difficult now to make some accusations. And of course, the temporary price, it's more or less market price, so it's nothing bad or good. Yeah, and as I mentioned, I mean, if Ukraine won't be able to inject enough gas in spring and summer 2015, it will be the risk for the whole European security of supply in upcoming winter. What's important about European countries and as a whole concept of energy security here in Europe, as for 2 years, and we follow it constantly, and we promote in Baltic countries to move on from political discussion to already adopting some decision where to build even LNG terminal. Until it bites. If there's stress test, and stress test shows, okay, you can survive 2 months, already everyone is relieved and moves on, and then summer passes, and then the same discussion would start over again in autumn. That's a problem of our psychology. And of course, energy dependency is two-way concept. Here it became already a three-way concept in relation with Ukraine. Talking about Russia's dependence, because nobody never raises a lot this question. I mean, of course, everybody says that the federal budget of Russia is filled in by export, from oil. Yes, it's true, but I mean, when we count our budget, we actually count every part of income of that, and gas also constitutes some part of it. But what's more important for Gazprom, it's market share, and to keep on market share for this company always was a priority. So by that, keeping a market share in European space, and of course, I mean, political implications at some point. And so its data, mostly from 2013, the dependency on Ukrainian transit system started to drop. Of course, when the Nord Stream was launched, but for example, the Nord Stream is underutilized by 40% around that. Ukrainian gas system, transmit system also underutilized around that amount. And that's why actually that was possible for Slovakia to, in the beginning, and for Poland to reverse some gas. I mean, about the reverse we'll talk later, because there's some different kinds of reverse. It's virtual, backhaul reverse, or physical reverse. So actually European countries, they use both. That when it's physical reverse, when they upgraded the pipeline, it's already not politically accusable. And when it's backhaul, so you would reserve that you would lower the pressure on one side and put it backwards. That basically you have to reserve the capacity and use the same pipeline. So, but still, like 53% of Russian gas is supplied through Ukraine. So it's important, and of course, even if the idea of bringing the gas hub to Turkish-Greek border would be ever realized, it still can take some years. So it's not overnight decision and not overnight process. So this picture would still remain. And I mean, Europe actually is good buyer of gas. So this is important buyer for Russia. And if we look more or less on concept, because when the European Commission was preparing the stress test for Europe as such, it was taking account that Russia would stop supplying gas to all transmission systems, right, to all pipelines. If you look just at those countries that somehow connected to Ukrainian transit system, so this picture is already more mixed. So every country is dependent partially, so it won't bring that huge damage to European countries if only through Ukraine the gas would stop. Because after 2009, lots of work was done, so that's not everything's all bad. But we will come to later to this issue. I mean, as we can say, the general picture looks quite diversified. But of course, there is usually, I mean, Central European and especially Southeastern European countries would have shortages of gas. I mean, shortages, I mean, for example, Bulgaria would have a shortage of 2 BCM because just to supply from other side, other gas, the capacity bottleneck appears, the congestion appears, and this is important in all this understanding the congestion and why the liquidity on market is important, why the requirement to have bidirectional reverse capacities in your pipelines is important, because if you're a market player, you always would seek to sell your gas where it's the price is jumps, and if the shortage would be there, so Bulgaria would buy it more expensive, and there would be like more suppliers willing to supply, but they wouldn't be possible just to put it in pipeline because it's limited. I mean, and of course, I mean, to go this trilateral understanding of this whole crisis, there appeared 3 concepts how all 3 parties started to approach how to improve the situation. So, I mean, the European response was basically, I mean, the gradual creation of a market, that's important. And of course, to foster gas flows and gas source diversification, it's important. What's important here to understand is the market base of approach. And when we already play, not just about going one prime minister to another prime minister to book some gas volumes for the next 20 years for some preferable price, because somehow it failed to work, for example, in Baltic countries. And but to bring a competition, and competition somehow balances it. And I mean, Ukraine's response was like, of course, to think how to reduce its dependency, and they started to think, but it's a problem of Ukrainian actually approach to that. Is the whole Ukrainian system, political system. If something was adopted like with one presidency, it was like dropped down fast, and mostly how Ukrainian side was working on energy just to give in some results that was on a paper, they were on a paper, but tactically there were no money, no budget, no political willingness to do so, and you know how it works in Ukraine. Hopefully now it started to work differently. About that we can tell you more. And of course, I mean, Russia's response to the crisis was more in a political line. So we see the two-way concepts, I mean market concept, and then the third concept is just to acquire ownership. Somehow for a monopoly and internal Russian approach to energy markets is a market of monopolies basically. And you have to control ownership, and ownership was always a key in this region. There's still ownership of some energy operators even in Baltic countries. In Ukraine, Ukraine was really eager always to keep the transmission system in their ownership. This was like, you know, the battlefield between Ukraine and Russia with any presidency. In Belarus, for example, they gave up already up to like 80%. No, I think it's already sold the 20% share, so it's 100% on ownership of Russia. Then in Armenia, they also sold out the last shares. So the ownership is really important. How the Russia takes care of its political interests in some countries, especially in Eastern Partnership. When we conducted research on that, I mean, in Moldova, where is this Transnistria region, Gazprom always implies with a debt that Transnistria does not consumes, and Moldova does not pay for that, because I mean they supply, they consume. Moldova, I mean, it does not control this territory. For Russia, it's really easy to use it in political level because there are like billions already of debt. The same in Armenia, when Armenia made a U-turn from association agreement with the European Union, the same year they bought the last shares in gas transmission system, the same in Belarus. So somehow this trend of ownership, it works well. I mean, And that's why the third energy package is the most painful ever recipe for Russia, was like ever adopted and invented. Just to see what's happening inside of Ukraine. So we observed somehow like kind of three-level trends of perception of security implication of the whole crisis. Mostly on political level. Now, if we would see, I mean, more how it goes on real demand level, I mean, Ukraine has its descending level in consumption of gas, but there basically took like several reasons for that, because it's high price. The price started to be increasingly high from 2009 and forward. You know about that contract. And of course, I mean, unreliable supplies from Russia. I mean, any political cabinet in Ukraine understood that it would be always difficult. So if we see, I mean, in 2014 and 2013, there's small red point appears. It's already reverse flows from European Union. That started, I mean, the reverse flows were basically started with Yanukovych. That was nothing, I mean, extraordinary at the time. That was basically just price moved from a really high price at that time. And it was a really huge pressure on the budget. And that's why they started to seek any alternative ways and negotiate with European counterparts. And I mean, basically about Yanukovych times in Ukraine, he really, I mean, the cooperation with NATO was kind of high on technical level. This all cooperation with European Union were high. There were also really a high level of pressure from Russia. I mean, he was not, of course, not kind of leader for that, but what I'm saying here is that these kind of decisions, they are all market-driven sometimes, not just politically driven, even in Ukraine. So now, starting from January, the reverse flows, they were significantly increased from Slovakia part. And that's really interesting story about Slovakian reverse, how it functioned, how it was created. I mean, basically now Slovakia started to supply around 40 MCM per day. It has a capacity, so the Ukrainians can book it. What Ukrainian government now wants is to cover around 60% of gas import demand annually. We will see about that. It would depend on the price, of course. Before, in the beginning, when they started to reverse, the price difference was around $7, $20, not that much. Then with Slovakian reverse, there was significant drop in price because Slovaks used more like spot market model, and that's why the competition came. So the suppliers started to, on open seasons, to supply, to make bids. So that first reverse, one of the first reverse from upgraded pipeline to Ukraine was really economically viable for Ukraine. That's how both sides of Slovakian side, Ukrainian sides, saw that it could be economically viable. Of course, Slovaks were really pushed politically. I mean, if you see the sources of gas in 2013, 2014, already some part of that yellow is European Union. I mean, speaking about security environment, right? I mean, this is a security environment of energy supplies. This is a red circle. And that's what every country would always want to avoid. And that's how, I mean, energy became a security issue in the region, because, I mean, honestly speaking, if Estonia would be now dependent for many years, imagine, or any country would be dependent on Norwegian supplies 100%. I mean, Germany supplies a lot from that. We don't perceive it as a security implication case. When there is a party that you are dependent on, but I mean, maybe playing with prices when it moods come on, or like, bad mood or politically considered. That's already when we start to put it in a space of security understanding. That's important how we actually in Europe started to conceptualize the energy and security understanding that was not before perceived. I mean, we are working in a defense and security center, and it was difficult to actually always to put security in this kind of concept. What do? I mean, we give advice on security, and we work mostly with the defense, Ministry of Defense. And somehow it starts to go in one line with that. I mean, if we understand how Ukrainian energy supply work and how Ukrainian understanding of securing its annual demand and consumption and covering that, it works really tightly. So it basically, Ukraine always produces around 20 BCM per year. Its gas demand consumption is around 50 BCM, but starting from 2013 it's 50, and then 2014 it's 40. This year it would be probably on the level of 44. So it's descending, but anyway, like 20 BCM is production. So another, for example, 25 around that it should import. So how it's doing? I mean, industry is always more or less covered, because why industry? Because companies produce inside of Ukraine and basically sell them to industries. So sometimes that's why the corruption cases appeared. They were selling domestically produced gas that the cost is lower than the imported one, and they were selling it by label of imported gas. So how the corruption, they basically were lying. Then other highly subsidized level, of energy consumption in Ukraine is heat, domestic, households. So for them, Ukraine should import in summer and autumn, and basically then start to on November, January to cover. That's why I raised this question of gas negotiations now upcoming. That's why it's important. Yes, and that's how unreliably also understanding of gas consumption in Ukraine was. The low efficiency, so the gas producers were selling it kind of profitably to industries that get profit from that, exporting some metal or production metal goods. So those two levels, they always lived in more understanding and profits, while the government had to cover always really heavily subsidized heat consumption in Ukraine. So basically, if it would be really hot, you would open window, and you just never were thinking about what energy efficiency is and how to save it. And about if we go from the storages, and that Ukraine could cover it winter demand, and it's quite a high demand, about 25, 26 or 30 BCM per year. So everything was consumed probably in winter, so you would need really huge storages for that. And this is a case Ukraine is interesting because this is a part of the contracted part of energy community now. Starting from 2009, 2008. So, and it has one of the biggest storages, and one of the most powerful transmission system, but not modernized. This is a concept contradictory, that one country kind of part of European already energy community that has all necessary infrastructure to be independent, to develop independency, and to be self-reliant, even if you would bring gas from other sources. but it's never is. While European countries, European Union, they are really struggling to upgrade and construct those big gas storages, to upgrade pipelines to bigger volumes. And that's the point why Ukrainian, infrastructure can be really used even by European counterparts in the future, when it legally and already mentally, I think, would be understandable that this whole infrastructure would be already part of European one. This actually data, you can enter it in GIE every day, and you would see how much they withdraw and how much they inject of gas, every European Union country, now Ukraine. And basically now the storage are fulfilled by 27-28%. So, and this amount, it's around 9 BCM, 3 BCM always should be there. So it probably, 6 BCM, Ukraine would count on that, 1 month or something. Really, they should start negotiating, because up to 31st of March, I think they won't keep on with that amount. So they would have to fulfill it already now, probably with that really drastically increased now recently for the last weeks from European Union imports. But the point of that, but if you don't have enough bidders, for example, like Statoil, somebody puts gas, they don't have enough, it will be again the Russian gas reversed, and Russia really tries to control that by dropping supplies to European Union. So how it happened this year to Slovakia, Poland and Romania, that they would have just enough for their own domestic consumption, not to reverse it to Ukraine. So this is really strategically important to understand now, that this crisis is just as we are now speaking right now, is really burning their minds in Ukrainian ministries and Naftogaz. So, about again domestic implications of the crisis, and this is the most, I think, related slide to the whole topic of presentation. And this is important to understand. Actually, this would imply have its implications to the gas consumption in Ukraine as such. Yes, it drops because the major production sites in Ukraine and metallurgy and chemical production, and those are energy really consumable are in the east. If you would see, probably no. Okay, if you would see the last one, the red circle, those are, export and energy consumption altogether. So eastern part of Ukraine, it's always accounted for a big part of Ukrainian GDP by, holding all sides of heavy industries. And what's important is electricity production. And electricity is really heavily relies on one special type of a coal that is called anthracite coal that produced not, Poland is not produced. That's the point that the sites of that production of this type of coal are 75% in Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast, that is Donbass. So, these two regions here, Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast, this one are here. So this one, black one, damaged infrastructure already. But this one, is a little bit outdated map because it has to be updated every day, and it's really kind of difficult already to acquire that. I would say, how always the coal production functions in eastern Ukraine, that is partially illegal, partially legal. So there is a huge, company that run by Akhmetov. It's called the Tech. It's part of SKM group. So they basically the main producers of electricity in Ukraine, and a large portion of what they were extracting coal that was illegal and sold for by high prices. But anyway, it always went to electricity production. So we have to count here in the official production and unofficial, but basically speaking, if 75% of this kind of coal is produced in this region, the electricity production company started to feel shortage already in August, September, and in December it already was really harsh time. So in November started to import some parts from South Africa, and because it's kind of difficult to acquire this type of coal, that's why now they negotiated with Poland, and Poland would probably help to modernize Ukrainian thermal power stations to another kind of fuels. So probably, I mean, to another kind of coal. And if to go to look at the outline of all this crisis, in July, when it was intensified, really the fighting in MH17 was shut down. So the whole situation was kind of drastic. So the heavy artillery already entered the territory, and that's when it started the damaging of a really critical infrastructure, especially the railways. And railways are really important to actually bring the coal to the, I mean, already non-controlled, controlled by Ukrainian government and territory. So what companies, energy companies now, and the same detect they're trying to do from Kiev is to negotiate with these pro-Russian forces that control this territory to bring the coal needed, because at the moment there are around, I think, 2 million of tons. That's enough for around like 3 months of energy production that are really just like stand still on this territory, that are produced but cannot be exported and brought like physically on the territory. What they're doing, these forces here, they just sometimes are reselling it, probably bringing it maybe to Russia, and then from Russia, Ukraine is buying it from there, or bringing it to Crimea. So it's kind of, you know, it's traveling around. Basic concept is that Ukraine has to produce electricity. So what they came up already, ministries, they started from September, they every day, like for 2 hours, they're shutting down sometimes electricity in some parts of it. But when you shut down, actually, it's also sometimes wrong concept. You have to turn on again, and it's even high spike on consumption. So this is a vicious circle. And in 2015, what's important, strategic understanding of this whole adventure around coal and electricity, Ukraine signed a contract with Russia. Okay, and why it's important? Because the Crimea would be supplied now with all like necessary electricity. And why it's important? Because they gave the discount to Ukraine for like around 30%, but Ukraine promised and obliged now to supply Crimea. So basically, on political level, for Russia saves its face in Crimea. For Ukraine, it saves this face to, I mean, to this part of Ukraine. But again, I mean, this kind of contracts are really not long-term fixed. Now there are negotiations on political level about conflict already going on in Minsk. So we will see how that would work out.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
This electricity supply contract with Russia, this is only about Crimea, or this is also for the...
This is just like Russia agreed to supply electricity to transmission system by the conditions that Crimea would be supplied as well, because I mean de facto Ukraine doesn't control Crimea, so they actually always used it as like a bargaining power with Russia, telling we are shutting down water, electricity, and gas supplies. And of course, this bargaining power little bit, I mean, helped Ukraine to get electricity supplies from Russia. So this kind of Crimea case is now jumping like a ball in negotiations, because if the supplies would be shut down in Crimea, the Crimean population would be angry probably on both sides. I mean, Ukrainian and Russia, but mostly on Russia, because it cannot provide what it promised, basically. So for Russia, it has to take care about it, and by taking care, it's going on some, steps back.
So basically, mainland Ukraine, except from Crimea, or maybe except from this, how is it called, People's Republic of Donetsk, there is still electricity supply. They don't hear about any large blackouts in Ukraine right now. So they can basically fill up the shortage of electricity by imported electricity.
Right
from
now,
Russia.
yes, but it was not the case before this contract was signed. As I explained, I mean, if Ukrainian part that is controlled by Kyiv, that they had shortages of coal to produce electricity, so basically they needed some backup electricity to provide electricity even to on the mainland of Crimea. So even not speaking about like eastern part and Crimea, so they went already to Russia to negotiate please supply. We would go on negotiations that we would continue supplying to Crimea, but they would supply to the mainland of Ukraine. So basically it covers all Ukraine now.
And how does the electricity supply work in the People's Republic of Donetsk? Well, there is no electricity supply. Is it entirely black?
How it worked always, the TEX that is the major electricity actually producer and a buyer, seller, wherever in Ukraine, they are all like, it controls all transmission systems of electricity in East. And the company now already located also, I mean, in Kyiv. They work with government. So basically, they tried always every damaged infrastructure to repair it fast. So they have like many brigades now there. Because if like one grid would be shut down, so another one would go and go. So they had to keep it on. They're still keeping it on. And basically, how Russia also supplies, it supplies also from the connection with that part of Ukraine. So this is important also to keep that kind of infrastructure. So basically the kind of concept of critical energy infrastructure protection here implies as well. And yeah. So if you have any other thoughts about it or questions. So basically we will see how they would, because probably, I mean, around 40% of electricity production in Ukraine relies on this hard coal that is anthracite. So basically 40% of those power plants should be now modernized to another fuel. And to do so, you need like money investment for that. If we see the agreement with Poland, I don't know actually how many of those power plants they would cover. And it would, of course, be with uncontrolled by Kyiv territory. But basically, if Ukrainian electricity system is synchronized with Russian one, it's the same like in Baltic countries. So desynchronization would be important in the future. So, I mean, trading. At the moment, it's just emergency steps. They are temporary. So basically, now the whole energy system of Ukraine should be reconsidered, especially now I think about electricity. Because the pipelines, actually, to destroy a gas pipeline in Ukraine, you would have to make like, I know, around 7-8 explosions. It's not that easy. It's also well protected, I mean, and it's also strong. And it runs not through the, it runs mainly through Kharkiv territories that is not under control by pro-Russian forces. So gas is not that critically in danger, but electricity and supplies to households and actually these emergency cases are important now.
Would you happen to know the amount of electricity that Russia supplies as a percentage of consumption, let's say?
No, unfortunately.
Energy agreement?
No, I have to check that out. So basically about the concept, I mean, how we perceive the implication of this crisis on Ukraine and European part. It's how to confront the Russian leverages, probably, and basically how to bring Ukraine in a more stable way of energy perception. And as I mentioned, is probably integration and in European gas network. So the basic steps what's now on commercial level started to be implemented, as we mentioned, reverse supplies, and that pushes actually now it's tactically and physically pushes faster for Ukraine to be integrated somehow to European market, because if it's already started to be a buyer on even small period spot market, so and Naftogaz, major European government controlled energy company, started to be already more market oriented. What's important to understand that when you create this kind of projects in a region, that has always a spillover implication, and you never build a pipeline to connect two countries. At least it should be that way. You have to make a risk, assessment, market assessment of all neighboring ones, and of course the assessment of that liquidity that it brings to the region. As we know, the Central and Eastern European countries are really limited in liquidity, and liquidity is really always supported by diversified and alternative options of acquiring energy resources. So, and the highest actually liquidity is perceived in the market always comes from LNG. But for this region, LNG started to be sexy topic recently, for the last two years. So now in Lithuania, they already launched the Klaipėda, the terminal independence, it is called. So they already supplied the first cargoes, I think 6 small cargoes, in December. Even Estonia already imported some and reserved for the 2015 really small portion of gas supply regasified from Lithuania through Latvia. Another one project, as we know, it's Polish LNG, and this kind of there are always many economic and research on economic viability of this project. But if we would follow this kind of the broader spillover concept of bringing connecting north to the south, and this north-south corridor in Central European, Eastern European region, and if you already consider that Ukraine, eventually will become already legal part of European gas network system. So basically, this is a big spillover. This is a big way to establish another kind of move around gas trading hub. About gas trading hubs, it also became really sexy topic, but what basically they suggested and already signed a contract, agreed at least, Poland and Ukraine, that the pipeline would be built around by I think 2019, 2020, that would connect LNG and actually would connect it to the big transmission system and metering station on Slovak border. So basically, Slovakia again comes up as important connecting part. And as we would see, on reverse flows, and now Slovakia current capacity is 40 MCM, so it's if you would book it always 40 MCM, it would be around 15 BCM per year. Then Poland, small capacity, and Hungary. Slovakia, they have what they did, EU Stream. They took one, I think 750 millimeter pipelines that they did not use, and EU Stream invested 20 million. That's really not high price of investment. And they did it, aside of any political discussion. It was a commercial project, and they made an open season, so the bidders would apply with some amount that they would be able to supply, and booked the capacity. So and Ukraine imported that, and the price was good. So and that was a really great example how apolitically that can be made, and finally the pipeline that important here is that the pipeline that goes already, I mean, crosses Ukrainian border on European Union, that part that goes on European Union was not used. So any political implications, legal contractual implications with Gazprom could not be implemented because in contract it's written, I mean, that part exactly part of transmission systems that is on territory of buyer or Slovakia, for example. So that's why Gazprom could not make anything with that. And I mean, basically LNG option is far-reaching, but if that would happen, and that spillover would affect also the Baltic countries, because in the Baltic countries what's happening now, and there were really political discussion over where to build a LNG terminal in Finland or Estonia. They did not come up finally with any decision. And it's important to this region that they're really low level, I mean, gas demand countries, that in total, the whole region with Finland consumes around an import of 8 BCM per year. That's not a lot. So if there would be big LNG terminal that would be able to attract kind of affordable prices, that would be beneficial for kind of all neighboring countries. That in future can be beneficial already to southeastern countries if those pipelines would be upgraded. And Slovakia already, I mean, after the South Stream was cancelled and the EU Stream was really active in proposing new projects. So basically it's not that bad idea to take those pipelines to upgrade them. This is basically what European Union requires, as we saw from previous concepts that when they applied, I mean, to upgrade all pipelines to build capacity and to make a possibility of bidirectional flow. And the problem of all these contracts is this one. I mean, that when you have a long-term contract, LTC, that why you book one direction of a pipeline, and that's why it's difficult to actually to navigate, I mean, the sense of reverse. So the basic, that long-term contracts and the contracts themselves, if European Union wants to shift from contracts to more market area and to bring finally the European single market, that should be functioning on a market basis. And when you have everything contracted, especially in eastern part, so basically all pipelines are booked, and in any crisis event, that leads to some legal implications. So at some point you cannot just use sometimes reverse flows, and that's the point when you have spots, I mean trade hubs in regions, especially as in northern part and northwestern part of Europe. That means liquidity, sometimes it means flexibility, and of course it's not always a better price. But when we talk about crisis measures and we talk about competition, those it leads already to competition, leads already to be competitive, and so that's a problem of actually of this endeavor of reverse flows. About prices, how we the overview of that. So basically, if we look at this trend line, so that was a new agreement with Russia, and of course, I mean the reverse prices, they were not always I mean beneficial. And if we look at this one, and at some point it's more, I mean, expensive, of course, but we have to understand as well that this is a temporary agreement, as is an agreement, and that's when we go in the concepts of contracts. That's somehow psychologically difficult in countries of even Baltic countries. And when we argue that the market should be developed, they would think and put their arguments. But contracts, and of course every country always prefers contracts. It's understandable. You can negotiate preferable price. You would be secured. You would sleep well. But now in a dynamics of one big supplier that already proved to be not that reliable, or even one transit country, for example Ukraine, also proved to be at some point not reliable. Thus, you would have to understand that you have to be flexible. And this flexibility sometimes leads to price volatility and price spikes. At this point, I mean, Ukraine did not lose a lot still on reverse flows, but the difference finally it's always around like $30 or something, but it's not that big. But again, the new reality would come after new negotiations in April and May. I mean, if we, again, going back to the concept of security, how to understand it, if you apply the concept of defense, you always build a procurement to be ready to defend your territory. So, and that's always built on a risk assessment and drills, and actually to be ready. Your response should be highly efficient and in short term. I mean, even 24 hours response, it's already not a response. And the European Union, even in NATO, European countries and even NATO alliance started to lose their response capabilities really drastically after the Cold War stopped. So basically, if the attack would happen, how long it would take us to respond, the same concept could be applied to energy security, how long it would take us to respond and to cover. And of course, when we understand the really critically viable, really critically important areas. And what Ukrainian crisis did in this sense, that it's a already different concept compared to 2006, 2009, when actually Ukraine could be accused to some legal implications, siphoning of gas and being not that transparent, being corrupt, yes. But after that, when Ukraine already became a contracted party of European for energy community, it already implemented many steps to be transparent, and this is already undeniable, and this is good. And there are already like several targets in Ukrainian doctrines that already mentioned, and the Naftogaz and all companies already putting all the data online. They're trying to be that way transparent. And now the crisis in 2014 and probably upcoming 2015 already brings, I mean, another understanding of this crisis is about defending and being ready to really defend your consumers, your households, your critical necessity of energy. So basically, the concepts already shift. The security of supply is such. It's not about bad guys, good guys. And of course, I mean, the market forces are important. And to understand that when we invest in real projects and when we consider more spot trading, and it's what we are really trying to push for, especially in Baltic countries. And again, this about reverse contracts and about efficiency and about actually protection of investments in infrastructure, about protection of stable contract practice. This kind of commercial viability and exemptions on that cases. Exemptions, I mean, every country now started to take exemptions in third energy package implementation. But this is, again, it's like a chicken and egg situation. What you're protecting, also you're prolonging your system as it is. So you're not letting in competition because you know the prices probably won't be that affordable if you won't provide a legal base for energy companies to operate here. I mean, and of course, I mean, as I already mentioned, that to keep on good relations, and go negotiation rounds with Gazprom is easier because you don't have to invest in anything. You just have to invest in your, I don't know, sedatives and be calm. But you don't have to spend lots of money on that. And then understandable, it's clear logic. If I'm in a government or I'm in European Union, why should I invest that huge loads of money? Because I mean, one country is in trouble and there's some countries are also in trouble. But that's a point that is contradictory to European single energy market, and it's important. The word is market, actually. And when we started to think, I mean, when the whole crisis erupted in summer, and there was upcoming already shortage of gas, and when Gazprom actually stopped supplying gas to Ukraine, and we started to look at that already, I think from last winter, and actually collecting the data from all transmission capacities from on all borders of European Union. And basically, if to take this risky endeavor and to imagine that that can be a market here in Europe, and that can be gas hubs and spot trade, and that you would go on a market and would bid and would book some capacities. And then, of course, we started to look at LNG, because LNG became really pretty hot topic, especially in this region. And of course, and then we started to look at these regions where they're like the hugest, I mean, the biggest LNG importers. And if we look at the practice of Spain, when pre-Fukushima LNG prices, and then of course how it started to actually to earn during when Japan started to attract LNG, it started to resell all this contracted LNG it had. I mean, it's because the difference between UK and Spain, that UK doesn't use contracts on LNG supplies, Spain uses. So basically, even Spain started to resell its LNG to South America, because South American countries never prefer contracts neither. So basically, there's one contracted party of LNG supplies, and they started to sell South America. But if you started to imagine this kind of security risk, that the gas would be cut, and would imagine that these countries could rely and would allow themselves to pay that higher price, that higher price could be accumulated and be paid by European fund in security measures. From these countries, it's not even possible to bring that regasified gas, because there is a huge bottleneck. There is a capacity here from Spain to France is 5.4 BCM. And while Spain imports around 65 BCM per year. It holds a capacity of regasification and the terminals across its shores. The same happens with the UK. It can import around like 54, something like around 50, but the connection with interconnector physical with Belgium is 20. So basically, even if these countries, I mean, would be completely in shortage of gas, and they would imagine that they could ship the LNG, and the time Klaipeda was not still online. These pipelines, basically, they don't allow to ship it, and that's how the idea of this balancing points, and that's contradictory, and that is this stepping stones for that kind of EU single energy market. And of course, I mean, this is those areas that you see those spikes in gas prices. But again, there were many stress tests that were published, and every stress test always takes different case scenarios. so how each country would behave. Now, for example, Germany's liquidity of trade hub, Gazprom, it depends on two factors of liquidity, is Nord Stream and liquidity of Dutch hubs. And Dutch hubs, they have LNG. So this kind of liquidity is not that reliable neither, because Nord Stream is also supplied heavily from one source. So basically, to eliminate this kind of bottlenecks, this is important, and of course, but under which perception, especially, I mean, if you imagine that in this region, now Lithuanian LNG terminal works, this Polish LNG terminal would be online, I mean, it would be connected here, and probably here. So, in the case, even if we overpay, because we have to compete for LNG for that price, we have to be able to attract it from global market. Even so, there would be a possibility to cover that. Looking at LNG, of course, it's like you are in a bunch of sea of sharks that's competition, and now, of course, starting from June, July 2014, the prices started to be narrowing down on a global level, because, I mean, Japan is going back to nuclear. But of course, now all these complications, if Australia puts online all these LNG terminals, but the economic viability of these projects is under the risk. Even Spain now loses money on reselling LNG. So the price volatility now is a big question on that. But anyway, it's one of the options, and the Ukrainian crisis somehow started to drive Europe to look already, not just to go and negotiate, but to sit down, I mean, to out some kind of market-based approach to get out from these situations. What's important here, we'll talk probably about this tomorrow, but about concept of competition and LNG. Finland and Estonia is a case of that. I mean, Finland now would construct this. LNG has a small-scale LNG that would supply only marine bunkering and industries, and those companies are by themselves consider investment, return of investment, seek the ports, but they would put the LNG because it would be linked to the local big production sites, so they would supply, because LPG became expensive, so they already consider it substituted by LNG. Those LNG terminals, around 3, would go online soon. So basically 25% of even Finnish gas consumption that goes on industry would be covered by LNG. What does it mean? Because it means that competition would appear, and somehow they would trade, and they would trade probably, of course, on contract base, but some would always like to resell it. So that's how they Finnish. They came up with the idea to book now LNG supplies from Belgian LNG terminal for the small-scale LNG in future. So basically, market is appearing, but it's appearing somehow on an ad hoc basis, and countries do not provide this kind of legal platform to develop that. And in basic, I mean, what's Ukrainian crisis and implication was that probably, I mean, the market perception of global energy markets comes closer, so they would look at that more. Even what Russia is doing, they also constructing now in St. Petersburg area a small LNG scale terminal near St. Petersburg area, so they could actually also supply, but already on competition level to Baltic countries and to marine bunkering or wherever any reasons. Even Turkish, Greek, again, the world gas hub, what they would do, I mean, probably in European countries, even if they would upgrade or have more pipelines to the Greek border, they would compete. I mean, if there would be a spot trade, I mean, it depends how Turkey and Gazprom would sell that on that borderline, that gas. Or we would be on a contract, but again, contracts reliable at some point when you have preferential attitude, and it's also, it's not economically viable approach. So basically, what's also important about market-based approach and markets coming closer to European Union, that now new contracts of and already previous contracts from 2010, and now it's appearing more, that they already indexed not to oil prices but to hub prices. That's already like, you know, typical practice in major global traders. Now, Spain, Netherlands, UK, they already started to create a contract that already linked to NBP spot prices, because they reflect more adequately, in an adequate manner, the real cost and the real price of energy resources. So, and especially now, I mean, with oil price volatility, Gazprom has with the European Union around like up to 2020 stretched like many contracts. So they should be reviewed somewhere in this half year, because the contracts, how, for example, in Ukraine, they was every quarter and half year they should be reviewed, because they're all based on the formula is changing, right? But okay, they're losing money, but everyone is losing those money, so it's all in comparison in. So basically, the main point here is to look closer on isolated points, balancing points. Those are especially, I mean, Baltic countries in the gas market. Electricity market is different. Baltic countries integrate more, and Central European, South European countries. And if to see Ukraine as already in concept of a part of those balancing point, appearing one, with those projects, commercially viable projects from Poland and Slovakia and Visegrad, especially countries. So that would be start changing how we perceive the security, actually implications of gas trade with Russia mainly. So I mean,